local touring. So I was obviously getting the motor ready for the long distances. But when in my first year of uni, a friend of mine went along to the local bike race and came back to college and uni and said, "Hey, Hodgie, there's this, I just went in a bike race. It's great. You should try it." And I came second in my first race. I won my second race, and I was hooked.
There you go. So was there anyone in particular, no heritage at all in relation to family who've done it? You just got into it. And it was at a time in Australia where there was not really a lot of, cycling wasn't a thing, was it? It's a European sport. Yeah,
oh, absolutely. And I knew absolutely nothing. I didn't know who Eddie Merckx was. I literally knew nothing about cycle racing. There are all these stories going around about how I rode the Goulburn to Liverpool in stubbies and an MSR helmet. And any of you who go back that far will know that the mountain climbing helmets, a bowl literally with 3 round holes in the front, was what we used to wear at the time. And I was a total wally.
Hubbard, I think we call them, and no disrespect to Hubbard who's on the call riding away, but
so
Hubbard is a common
wally. Hubbard means you just go slow and you're a wally. Wally means you can go not so slow but you still know nothing.
Now, so you've got your team bag up there. It's not once, it's once, isn't that how you pronounce it?
Yeah, once, if you're a true Castellano speaker, or once, if you're more from down south of Spain, but it's Organización Nacional de Ciegos Españoles. So that's the National Spanish Blind Organization. And they started sponsoring a team in about 92 or 3, I think. Earlier than that, yeah.
While I know you've actually come along prepared to sort of peel off those layers, I'm not going to know how you're going to do it with your glasses and your headphones on, but maybe while we do that, you can start peeling this off while I just get to this next question. So it really was a time for you when you joined, a golden era of cycling. There were so many legends like Cipollini, Greg LeMond, 5-time Tour de France winner Indurain, and so many records set at this time. We had Andy Penn on last week, the CEO of Telstra, and he told us about how sometimes he'd be sitting in meetings with heavy hitters of industry like Rupert Murdoch and Bill Gates and Elon Musk and asking, "What am I doing here?" So did you ever feel overawed by those around you in the peloton?
Yeah, look, that's really interesting. I mean, it's such a complicated scene, even just riding and being able to keep your position in a bunch. And you should ask Matthew about this next week as well. For at least 2 years, you know, I could not ride up near the front consistently. And the other thing is that the level of you know, focus and concentration needed over hours and hours and hours without a single momentary lapse was extremely difficult. So for 2 years I was all over the shop. But then in my 3rd year, when, you know, I had started to get quite effective and working for my team leader at the time, Marino Lejarreta, I can remember the moment where I sort of was walking, you know, in an evening of the Tour of Italy, you know, after dinner with a couple of my teammates, and, you know, Gianni Bugno was sitting beside the road with his guys having a cup of herbal tea or whatever, and he sort of said, "Oh, hi, Hodgie," and then I suddenly thought, well, oh, okay, I'm recognized in the peloton. I know I can, you know, because I know I'm being effective and I know I can ride where I want. So that was quite a psychological milestone in a way, and an emotional milestone about fitting in, about being recognized for the effectiveness that I had. And I mean, those bunches are quite incredible, you know, and you've got a constant sort of apex at the front and turning inside. And if you're really good, you can just stay in behind the head of the you know, the apex of the peloton, doing 40, 50 plus kilometers an hour. And if you're not, you're struggling down the back. And you've seen what happens in echelons when you're down the back. You know, it gets narrower, 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 lined out. Then you don't have any protection. then the groups start breaking up, and then you spat out the back.
So, and now, is that part of it then ability, or is that part of also the unwritten rules around who's allowed up the front as well? I think, you know, they can just shut you down in the peloton if you're not actually known or respected, right?
Absolutely. So it's really interesting, the sort of the social control that's exerted. So, you know, professional cycling has always been a key way that you know, people who don't otherwise have a chance to become rich and famous make their way in the world. So if you do something stupid in a bunch, like cause a fall, you could cause a cyclist to break his arm or his leg and not be able to provide for his family. So that's really, really frowned on. And what people don't understand is there's actually a great sort of camaraderie that reigns in the bunch, at least in my day. I presume it would still, so that if you're a dickhead, basically, people know you are, and if they see you coming up beside them, it only takes millimeter changes in your, you know, where you're riding to stop them moving. But if you see Miguel Indurain or, you know, one of the champions come up beside you, you know, there's always a little glance back, a shoulder check, and you see it's, you know, a champion. Well, you move 10 millimeters that way and he gets through. So there's a really sort of, there's just a very subtle, nuanced behavior which can be the difference between winning and not winning. It's very easy to stop someone winning if you don't like them and if you think they don't deserve to win, you know. And I remember when Neil Stevens won the stage, his stage in the Tour, the guys that he was in the peloton, in the breakaway with, they said, well, no, you know, Steve-O's a good guy. You know, he deserves to win. I'm not chasing him down, you know, and he won a stage in the Tour. But if he was a guy that used to annoy everyone and attack in the feed zones, they would have chased him down and he wouldn't have won the stage, you know?
Yeah. Interesting. So, you know, it is not just all about the ability. There is definitely where you actually fit in the pecking order of the peloton. Now, so just cycling back, notice the pun, 10 years, and you actually did 14 Grand Tours. So again, for the non-cyclists, just some context, the Grand Tour is a 3-week event. The Tour de France is a 3-week event, essentially 3.5 weeks of cycling, the odd day off here or there. I'm not sure if they had rest days when you did them, but that means in some years you did 2 Grand Tours in a year. Tell us about the mental and physical sort of attributes you need to get through that.
I mean, that's a really interesting question, because everyone says, how on earth do you do, you know, 3,500 Ks in 21 days? But you don't do it cold. You don't just come into it without an enormous amount of endurance. So, you know, you start training in November or December. January, you're doing 100 kilometers a day. You go to Europe, you do your training camps. You know, late January, February, March, you're doing small 5-day tours and 1-day races. April, all the classics. You're doing Milan San Remo early in the year is over 300 kilometers from where you actually start riding to where you finish riding, because there's neutral, you know. So, and then you get through May and June with some of the 10-day tours. So by the time you get to the Tour de France, or by the time I got to the Tour de France, I'd have about 15,000 kilometers in my legs for the season. And it's really interesting. I actually knew that, I knew after years and years how many Ks I needed in my legs. And then it really didn't matter if my preparation had been intensity, how many blocks I'd done, whatever. If I got to the Tour with 15,000 Ks in my legs, I knew I'd be fine. You know, I knew I'd be on it. But yeah, you know, you don't learn those things early in your career. But yeah, I mean, by the end of it, you know, as an old dog, I knew all of this stuff. So it's really interesting. You know, that's how you get through the Tour. You've had an incredible build-up, and it's going to be really interesting this year. I don't know how the guys are going to stay upright, stay uninjured, and have the endurance in September when they're doing this tour out of lockdown, you know.
And what about the mental toughness, Stephen?
Well, that's the same. I mean, that sort of builds up. I have to say that it's experiences, you know, through your career that really it makes you or breaks you, basically. So, you know, there are always days when you struggle, where for whatever reason you're just not feeling great, and there have been times where you know, I've been literally the last rider across the line in Spain once, in the Tour of Spain. You know, I literally was a bit sick. I must have had a virus or something. You know, the third last day was was a really difficult day, and I was told go in the breakaway. Got in the breakaway. We had a big 15k climb down, up and down, and then a finish up 6k climb. And you know, I got dropped from the break straight away on the big climb. Everyone passed me halfway up the big climb. The top of the big climb, I was with only the sprinters, and we call them the fat asses because they're so slow over hills. I couldn't even keep up with them. They dropped me when we got to the last climb, and I finished in front of the broom wagon. And I was really worried about, you know, my health. And I said to Manolo, the director at the time, I said, look, I really think I should pull out of the race. And he said, oh, no, you're right. You know, you'll be right. Just see how you go tomorrow. The next day was the longest stage of the Vuelta. Anyway, luckily it was fairly benign, and I sort of yo-yoed and elasticed on the back all day long. And all the guys, you know, they knew how much I was suffering, and they'd be looking around, just keeping an eye out for me. But we were battling for the Vuelta at that time, I think, with Alex Zuller. He was running second to Rominger. But the mere fact they could see me still in there, suffering like a dog, just to get to the finish, meant that I think not only did I learn, I went deeper than I've ever gone, but then the next time you're in that point, you think, well, okay, I know what this is like. I've been here before. I can even go a bit deeper. And this happens throughout your career. If you overcome each really big, you know, hole that you get through, you're stronger for the next time. And I think one of the records I'm most proud of is that I never did not finish one of the Grand Tours that I started. I finished every single one of the 14, which is unusual. So I'm really happy about that.
That is impressive. I mean, what you're describing, mental toughness and getting dropped off the back, that's just the usual group ride for me and the guys that I ride with. So I must be mentally tough, I must say. Now, I think you were just, sequence-wise, you were just a little bit behind Phil Anderson, who's obviously a trailblazer for non-European English-speaking cyclists. And he came on, peel it off, next layer.
This is 1989 when I rode my first tour. And I rode it, we changed sponsors halfway through. So there's the jersey from my first tour, that one. And we're about to go to 1990 now.
There we go. Well, you just wrestled that back into, oh, beautiful. I love the pink. That must have been for the Giro. Now,
that was for the tour,
we had Phil Anderson. We had Phil Anderson on, and he actually said one of the things that he struggled with was just the language barriers. Was that an issue for you as well, and cultural sort of disconnection, being one of the few Aussies in the peloton?
Yeah, look, that's a huge issue. You don't participate in life unless you can speak to people. And I was lucky. I had 3 years in Switzerland as an amateur before I turned pro. And I lived in the German-speaking area, and I used to babysit for a family in the little village where I lived, and she was English and he was Swiss, so she used to teach me in return for babysitting. She used to teach me German, and I worked half days, you know, with a Swiss company, so I had to basically fully immersed, had to learn very quickly, and I'd actually learned French at school, so that helped me. I then, in my second year, went and lived in the French-speaking part of Switzerland. So I was completely immersed, and all of us go through this. We're all jump in at the deep end, completely immersed, cannot avoid learning the language unless you live in an enclave of like Americans, if you're in Girona and you live with all the Yanks and the other Aussies, whatever, I don't know. But I never did, so I'm really pleased about that. And you've got to just grab the life with both hands, you know.
Well, speaking of language barriers, one of your good teammates, I think, was the Irishman Sean Kelly. Now, is there any truth that sometimes his accent was so bad you actually had to say, Sean, speaking French?
Any of you have listened to him on Eurosport know he is bloody impossible to understand, right? So, I mean, there have been instances where, you know, he'd take along a small band of, you know, teammates because he'd been paid a big fat contract to ride some minor race on the cobbles, you know, that we all hated. But, you know, you had to go along if the world number one for 7 years said, oh, Hodge, you're coming, and you and you and you. And so we'd be driving on the front, you know, doing 60 k's an hour to lead him on to the cobbles in the front of the peloton, right? And he'd be going, hey, Hodgie, and I go, huh? And he go, Hodgie, and I go, what? I said, in the end, I just used to say to him, Sean, tell me in French. And he used to speak to me in French, you know, and I used to, I'd say, oh, thank God I can understand you now. He spoke French better than he spoke English. I kid you not.
There you go. That's a great story. So just in terms of, and we'll round it out, and we're going to sort of move on a little bit. In terms of your career, because it was a long career, and you actually, I think, were relatively old when you retired. You were about 35 when you retired?
Yep. Yeah, I turned 35 the year that I rode the Olympics, yeah.
So you actually, tell us, there was a particular thing where you're actually in on site, and where your role, you were no good on the hills. I get that. I'm just no good, but particularly bad on the hills. But you actually then talk about how as a team member, an on-site was a true team. Tell us a little bit about what you mean by they were a true team.
So it's really interesting, and as I, you know, got a bit older, I had to look for every last hook to keep ahead of all the young guns, you know, because they were always there. You're always fighting for selection to be able to ride the Tours or the Giros or the Vuelta or whatever. And what was the question you asked me again?
Well, tell us, honestly, I think your experience with them was, it really was a true team culture. So tell us a bit about why that was, and maybe the role that you had in the team.
So I was taken to ONSE by my captain from the 89 team, Caja Rural Patanina, which I just showed you. And one of the things that I did with a sports psychologist I had at the time was I decided on a strategy of being the ultimate professional. So being just doing my job in a way that most people didn't. And I devoted myself in the big races where he was a tour winner chance, devoted myself to his looking after him. And that's where I really started to get a name for myself as a super domestique. So he had a habit of famous for riding, you know, all the tour officials and everyone knew he would be last wheel for the entire stage leading up to the start of each climb, right? And so you had to be there with him. So it'd line out in the crosswinds. I'd be just above him in the wind, keep him safe, and take him up so that when we got to the hill, and so he could be relaxed, right? He just didn't want to stress all day long, which was great for him and bad for us. But anyway, so we'd take him up to the hill and then come around and take him all the way up to the front of the bunch, always on the first hill, right? The mere fact of just thinking purely about how to ensure he was in the right place at the right time meant that I started not thinking about my own pain and suffering, and I was able to actually, you know, overcome those internal limits you have where you start to feel bad and you're just thinking about yourself. But that fact of getting him where he needed to be meant that I blew away all these barriers I had about climbing, and I became a lot better climber. The other really important thing about the team, there are two other aspects to this ONSE team that were quite unique. One was that we were representing every blind, deaf, and dumb. So, and I know we don't use those terms anymore, but you know what I mean. People with speech and hearing and blindness difficulties in Spain. We were their representatives in the seeing world, and part of it was we used to go to the schools for the deaf, dumb, and blind, and they would come and they'd want to meet you and feel you and see which one you were, and they knew all of us. So you were riding for a cause above and beyond yourself as well, okay? If you're in the Pyrenees on a 30K climb, you're suffering like a dog, well, what's your suffering compared to all the people that you represent? So that was another big thing. And the third thing was that Manolo was really not about our age, the director, Manolo Saiz. And he was a very, you know, Latin cultures are lovely. You know, they're very familial, very close. You know, Manolo would come up and he'd be talking to you and have his arm around you. And he engendered a sort of a really close-knit team spirit, which meant that we would give above and beyond ourselves just for the team. Most riders would always hold back a bit for their own performance, right? But if we had a team strategy, 3 riders were the leaders, we didn't care because it was such a positive environment, and that's why we got the name Yellow Armada, because we sowed fear and mayhem. You know, there was a stage every year in the Vuelta where you come down a big hill super fast onto a flat. There is always a roaring crosswind, and we would just split the thing to smithereens, and it was the most exciting thing to do. And we would all come as a block. Everyone knew we were going to do it. They could do nothing about it, and that was part of that just giving 110% for the team.
And that sort of spilled over later in your career. You actually then, and Anna, I'll get you to flash up if you can a picture of Stephen with a few. You actually then later in your career was also a great leader and mentor for some up and comers. And I think you might know who we're going to show here once Anna brings it up. But tell us about, I suppose, your transition then from being a team member then to being a mentor and coach for the next generation of Robin McEwen, Stuart O'Grady, Henk Vogels.
Look, yeah, it's really interesting. That aspect was sort of unexpected. You know, everyone knew I was a Gumby Wally, you know, when I went overseas, and I came back as a really good cyclist. And all of a sudden, guess what everyone was doing? They were going to Switzerland to ride as an amateur, just like I did. And a few of the poor guys came back with their tails between their legs because they had no idea what people like Hank and Stewie and Robbie and I had been through to get where we got, and Matthew, who you'll talk to next week. No one saw the pain and the suffering and the homesickness and the everything that we'd been through, and they just assumed, oh, you went to Europe, you came back a real gun, you know. So, but it was great when, but we did start a movement, you know, Phil, Alan Piper, Michael Wilson, Neil Stevens, myself, Scott, Scott from Inverell was there in the middle as well. So, you know, we did start something, and it was fantastic to see them all come over. And my goodness, you know, like I had a great career, but these guys have done twice what I ever did, you know, and that's really great. You know, I think it's fantastic.
But I think, in fairness, you're one of the pioneers, probably up there with Phil Anderson, it's fair to say. Now,
yeah,
Stephen,
Phil was the pioneer, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And competitive, by the way. We got him on Zwift, and he just wanted to race everyone.
Yeah.
So we're going to fast forward a little bit. So post-cycling career, you established a marketing and PR business with your wife, and you're also on the board of Cycling Australia for 10 years. You were doing weekly poly pedals around Canberra, as well as being inducted into the Hall of Fame and having the Stromlo mountain bike course named after you. So you achieved a lot and were well established in a new career when at about the age of 50, there was a moment that changed all of this for you while doing a school visit. Talking about your career. Tell us about what that was and what was going on in the world of cycling at that time.
Well, I mean, obviously, as we all know, my era was not a clean era, and a really good friend of ours, her daughter was in her high school class and asked me to go along and talk about cycling. And you know, as someone involved in that era, you had very good ways of obfuscating and just not really answering questions straight up. She asked me straight up, you know, did you ever dope as a cyclist? And I said no. And as we know, you know, being on the board of CA, the first time that I was ever really in a position of conflict was when Matt White was named on the French Senate list of cyclists who had taken drugs. So we had to decide his fate as a board, and that was really an impossible thing to do ethically and morally, and that's what caused me to have to inform the board that I would have to stand down, and I couldn't. And standing down, I also then, of course, had to explain why I was standing down. So that precipitated all manner of stress and strain and difficulties. But yeah, you know, it was the only thing I could do, and you know, and I made it a full clean breast of it.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about it in such good spirits now, but let's be honest, it was very tough for you. But maybe for those, you touch on this as well, that it was in an era. It was an era, and there was a context. So tell us a bit about the context of what it was like when you were faced with these choices and decisions, I think, that you say you did make, but there was a context for your decision, wasn't there?
Yeah, so professional sport is really interesting. Traditionally, and especially in Europe and many countries, even Australia, there have been very few ways that if you were born in a low sort of socio-economic situation, there are very few ways that you had any hope of fame and fortune. And that was professional sport. And in the old days, it was boxing, football, soccer, and cycling. So I was cycling, so if you think I was cycling as a pro more than 30 years ago, I was riding with guys from farming families who grew up in farmhouses with dirt floors, where the animals were down that end of the building and the family lived up this end of the building. So they had, you know, there were no barriers for them to fame and fortune. They would do whatever it took. You know, I came from Australia with an upper middle class family, a father, a doctor, and I had a science degree, you know, before I even started cycling. That's when I started cycling at uni. So I had a completely different outlook on all of this, you know, and it's a continuum. It's not you do or you don't. Everybody is looking for an edge, you know. So on the continuum, you know, luckily I was educated enough to know the impact and the effects of everything you could do right to the really bad end of the continuum, right? So there were some things I would never have taken, but there are other things that under medical supervision are used therapeutically, and EPO, of course, is one of those, right? So, you know, it wasn't in my era a case of you did or you didn't. It was just how far you went down the path, you know. And I chose a position here, you know, and I'm not saying what anyone else did, but I knew what I was doing and why I was doing it, you know.
And when you came out and sort of, I suppose, did come out and sort of say, I'm resigning, I do have to come clean, I did take EPO in my professional cycling career, you know, in the context of where you were at the age of 50, what did that mean for you, and how did that affect you?
Well, we already had a very, you know, successful business, and so, you know, I made a decision sort of immediately in my own heart and in my own head But my wife was saying, you know, you just made this decision. I've already thought about the consequences. You know, we could lose all of our clients. We could destroy our livelihoods. And not how could you do this? She understood that, but I mean, she was crying in bed every night for a week, and it was a very traumatic thing. One child of mine was on her gap year in the UK and was ringing home saying, "Are there going to be TV cameras outside the door?" and all of this. I do have to say that on the front page of the newspapers, it was Obama, Tony Abbott and Stephen Hodge for a while. But anyway, but yeah, so it was a very traumatic time. There's no getting around that. But the only thing that obviously kept me going was that there was no option, and it was the only thing I could do in the circumstances. And weirdly, it wasn't at all negative. All of our clients said, "Look, you're doing great work for us. We know you for that. We, of course, don't agree with what you did, but we're very happy with the working relationship we have with you." And weirdly, it didn't damage it's not quite true, but it gave me a certain ability then to be seen to be truthful. I don't know. It's hard to explain, but
human, fallible.
Well,
and
yeah.
maybe in that context too, I think you actually talk about your story and the work then that your story then sharing with Men's Link. So tell us a little bit about that and what Men's Link is about.
Look, there are a number of things that I've done, as you heard earlier, JDRF and so on. So Men's Link is a youth mentoring charity, and it's really about helping young guys at risk of future, going off the rails. And they were very happy. Everyone in that organisation, the CEO and the police were sponsors because it's a crime prevention thing as well. They're very happy for me to be able to tell a story about how this guy, to the young youths who at times were really, really struggling, a guy that can turn up in a suit and a tie has actually made the wrong decisions, but he's come clean about it, and look where he is now. He's quite successful. So they love my ability to go in and talk to the young men about this, because it really helped them with their mission as well.
Is the sport clean now, do you think, Stephen?
Oh, look, I think it's transformed, and it had to. It really was going crazy. It really was ridiculously unhealthy towards the end of my time, and it was getting worse. So I think it is certainly transformed. I don't know. I'm not really in close contact with the sport and haven't been for a couple of decades now. But I think, you only have to look. I mean, Claudio Capucci took off one year when I was riding on the 18th of July to Sestriere, 4 hours, rode away. This little tiny tidge of a guy rode away from everyone, finished solo. You look at the little climbers and everyone now, and they attack and they just get just in front. The racing, you can see it's different, Yeah,
and probably better for it. Obviously, it was an extraordinary era. Now, we're going to actually move. We're coming to the end of the ride, and people are coming to the end of the 45 minutes. I will flag to everyone, you're welcome to stay on. What Stephen has graciously given us a little bit of his cup of coffee time out till 7:30. It is an interesting topic. We're now moving probably the part of your career which you're in right now, Stephen, is the work that you do as an advocate for investment by government in infrastructure, which is not only about cycling but about better transport for all of those sorts of reasons. But before we get there, you actually have really had a lifelong connection with cycling. Tell us about the cycling you do now, and maybe that's a nice segue. What do you do today? A training day? Do you still get out on the bike and ride hard, and do you commute around? Tell us about that.
So Team Hodge, Squadra Hodge, has been going for 20 years. 20 years.
There's a jersey for everything.
Yeah, so this is our team kit. And so I ride 2 or 3 times a week. Go out in the morning, I do charity rides. I ride polypedal with the MPs, JDRF for 15 years and so on. So I love riding. I keep fit. I have a fold-up Brompton in a carry bag that I can travel with. I have an e-bike, which I can go to meetings with a suit and tie and not get too sweaty. You know, I have an old mountain bike, but my road bike is still my main thing because I can get out. 10 minutes later, I can be with the boys, finish with a coffee, get to work, you know, back home by 7:45. So I think all of us are all pedaling away, loving that life. So I'm a mammal too, still. Yeah.
But I think what's interesting is your professional cycling career, your time in Cycling Australia was focused probably on that small aspect of competitive cycling. And now what you're doing, you're with an organisation called We Ride, and you're actually spending a lot of time lobbying governments on infrastructure. Maybe we just leap to the point now with COVID and lockdown, the creation of this event came from lockdown and the inability for us to get out on the road to ride together. Tell us a little bit about what your foundation work is, the lobbying you're doing, and a little bit of the stats that sit behind transport congestion, health, mental health, etc. I know there's a lot.
Okay, so very quickly, cities with population growth cannot accommodate the percentage of trips that are being done by private motor vehicle any longer. It's already very bad. It's going to get worse. State government transport departments and feds don't talk about it publicly because it's too apocalyptic. They are looking by any which way they can to reduce traffic congestion. We know, and so what can you do? The opportunity is with transferring short trips to cycling, walking, and public transport. We know that there is a huge opportunity with shifting trips to cycling. I've just got a stat which is about to come out on a promotional video I'm doing that'll be launched in a week or two. In Melbourne, in Greater Melbourne, 41.5% of all trips every day are less than 3 kilometres. Greater Melbourne and the regional centres like Shep Bendigo, it's 50% out there of trips are less than 3 kilometres. Other cities, it's a little bit less. So there's an enormous opportunity to shift those trips that we unthinkingly do by car, right, to a healthier, more enjoyable mode. But we need the facilities. We need seamless connected networks that don't dump us onto a busy road. We know that countries that have high rates of cycling are safer because they have invested in that infrastructure. The Netherlands, Germany, Denmark, and so on. And we know that of the 2/3 of Australians that are not currently considering cycling for transport, more than half of them would if those facilities existed. Women are indicator species. Women are like the canaries in the coal mine. In safe cycling countries with high rates of cycling, more women ride than men. In Australia, 10, 15, 20% of all trips by bike are done by women. We have got it so wrong, and that's my life's work. There it is.
And will be your legacy, because I think, it will be your legacy. It'll be a last-longing legacy if you actually get to pull this off. I suppose just talk a little bit about what there is, I think, a number of organisations. One of the things that, in my limited experience, is the number of organisations that seem to be pulling in the similar direction, but a little bit different, have their own niche. How important is it for them all to come together, particularly now while we have reduced traffic on the roads? How important is it that they all come together now and we do lock in some permanent changes post-lockdown?
So we know that you get results when you speak with one voice. The anti-smoking campaign is a terrific example of that. So we're committed. We started an Australian Bicycle Summit about 5 years ago because there was no one bringing all of these advocacy voices together. So we've got a federal government role. Our foundation, the We Ride Australia Foundation, works federally. But we've got great traction from the health promotion bodies because we're all way too overweight and obese. You know, we've got great support from the urban planning groups because you need, better designed communities go along with the infrastructure to make it all a lot more livable. So, so councils have a role to play, state governments and so on. So, there's a parliamentary friendship group for better cities, which we're a foundation member of, to speak directly to MPs about, the things that cities do, and children are really the Trojan horse for a lot of the work that I do. All right. So if you can get kids riding, not only are you creating cyclists for life, it's unassailable. A shock jock won't go you in the media for doing something to get kids walking and cycling because everyone agrees it's a great idea for kids to be active and healthy, right? So, so we've got a pilot program up on the Sunshine Coast using smart technology beacons so that when the child arrives at school, parent gets a message, Johnny or Jane's arrived at school on their smartphone app. When the child leaves school, parent gets a message. So one of the greatest barriers, as I'm sure all of you parents will know, is that concern about independent travel and whereabouts. So if in addition to the safe routes to school, you also get informed when they arrived automatically without any intervention needed by the child themselves, that overcomes another significant barrier. I want to make it the new Ausswim. We've got a dispersed series of ride to school programs, but if we can create a national image that everyone says, yeah, that's a great idea, we want that in our schools, that's the scale up we need to make a difference in Australia,
And Stephen, I know everyone's finished their meetup ride, so we encourage people to stay on if they can and listen and come through with their questions. So if you can raise your hand to Anna or put it in the chat group. I've got one question from Ag, which I'll read out. But I suppose one thing, you've got an audience here. What things can anyone else do to sort of swing in behind this movement?
So we're actually working on a delightful little sketch animation video, which is going to, the call to action is for people to call their local councils and say, ask what they're doing for cycling locally. Now, councils at this time are really cash strapped, but if we can get them and the state MPs understanding how much demand there is for better bike infrastructure, we start to change the game. So it's really getting an awareness of decision makers. No one's sticking their head up above the trenches for cycling because it's too divisive. But if we use children and people and mums and families and so on to add pressure, then we start to change the game. And it could be riding to work one day a fortnight. If everyone changed one trip a fortnight to cycling or walking or public transport, that is almost the reduction in traffic congestion we need to significantly improve the roads, So
sounds like a good place to start. It sounds like a good place to start. Big changes come from little steps. So, Anna, I'm not sure if you've got any questions that you see from the audience, if anyone's waving their hand up, but Ag has actually asked one in relation, and this is going to be controversial, I think. What is your view on one voice for all cycling disciplines? And Ag is calling out, as the president of the Brunswick Cycling Club, the Oz Cycling Initiative.
So we've been talking to Duncan and Steve Drake, the CEO of CA, for many months as they've been through the process. One of the 4 pillars of cycling, of this One Cycling, is advocacy. So clearly we're of interest to CA. They straight away asked us to consider joining One Cycling, but the sport is still has a narrow focus on what advocacy is, and they've got a lot of ducks to line up to get this through. I do feel, however, that the ability, it is the single opportunity we've seen of the last couple of decades to significantly change the game for cycling in Australia. It is what we've been working towards, you know, with summits and so on, getting everyone around the table together. So it does have the potential to be a huge game changer. We are ready to assist with that, but it's all about the model, and the only friction has come, I think, from the different organisations about a lack of flexibility, I think, in the discussions around what that model is. But our side of the fence, the advocacy side, has such a different agenda to the sport that you know, it could be quite difficult depending on what the model proposed is. Matthew Heyman. Yes. So Matt's just asked a question, you know, do you remember giving me an ACT Schoolboys Award when I was 15? Absolutely, I do. And that's a wonderful thing. Matthew came from a family of 3 cycling brothers, and one of them was on his way to beat me in a local time trial, I think at the end of the year, when thank God he flattered and I wasn't shamed by a young Canberran beating me. Matthew went to the same school as my younger sister, and I do remember, Matt, that I went along and gave you that award. I remember that very well. Absolutely. And someone else asked, interested in some Paris-Roubaix pain stories. Well, I want to talk to Matthew about his, so I might have to dial in next week and listen to Matthew talk about Paris-Roubaix. That was the most disgusting race in the history of cycling. One head of my radius broken, one collarbone broken, you know, yeah.
This is spoiler alert. Spoiler alert.
Never to ride again.
There's one from Charles as well. I don't know if you can see that, Stephen.
Major roadblock for changing people to commute via cycling. So it's the perception of safety is really important. So usually it's a lack of understanding that there are often routes that you can take to work. Part of the problem that I know we talked about yesterday here in a telco in Canberra was that the routes are often less direct than if you drive. So, you know, it might be 5 Ks direct by car, but it might be 7.5 Ks by bike if you want to stay off the roads. It can be end of trip facilities. So it's quite a complicated situation, but the state governments are really starting to work hard. You all need to go and use those pop-up lanes that have been established for COVID, right? You need to make sure you send an email to the councils and the government doing this pop-up stuff. They need to have the confidence that they can keep doing it and not get smashed for doing the right thing for cycling, all right? There's a lot of you on the line. You need to send a congratulatory email to Clover or the Sally Cap in Melbourne or the Minister, and you need to say, this is great, please do more, all right?
Awesome. I think that's a great idea. And again, we've got a number of people on the call today who then have their own networks. So reach out to those networks and get behind it. Stephen, we're going to wind it up there as we come to the bottom of the hour. I think there is so much we could spend our time talking to you about. Thank you on behalf of all the Telstra Connected Cycling community for a very candid, educational and informative discussion this morning. Now, coming up in the next 3 weeks, as you know, we've got Matt Heyman, I think, hopefully with both hands on the wheel, eyes forward, listening in as he drives through France. I'm sure it's sunny. Hopefully it's not COVID infested. After Matt, we've got Mike Abid, who is former CEO of SBS and now executive in Telstra Enterprise. And then following that, we've got Duncan Armstrong's old coach, Laurie Lawrence. And Laurie's going to come on once we can work out how to get him on the WebEx and show him the technology, because if you reckon some of our other guests struggle with technology, I dare say Laurie's going to be that. Now, so we're going to wrap it up. It's been a great morning. We're going to throw to you Loretta Willerton. Are you there, Loretta?
I'm here. Can you hear me and see me?
We can. All
right.
So, Loretta, sign us off.
Thanks, Sandy, and thank you, Hodge. It was an absolute pleasure to work up a sweat with all of the group this morning and listen to the amazing insights. I loved hearing about your mental toughness and pushing through, and also your quest to change the way we commute and improve so many aspects of our livelihood. So thank you so much. See you all later. And thanks to Telstra Connected Cycling. Yeah.
Well done, Loretta. Thanks very much, everyone. We'll see you all again next week.